A husband stands in a pit dug into a courtyard, buried up to his waist, with one arm strapped tight against his side. In his free hand he holds a short wooden club. Above him, on level ground, his wife walks a slow circle around the hole. She is carrying a rock. The rock weighs 4 or 5 pounds, and it has been knotted into the end of her veil so she can swing it like a flail. If she catches him in the skull with it, he dies in that hole and gets dragged out by the ankles. If he grabs the veil and hauls her down into the pit with him, he is allowed to strangle her, and the law will call it justice. This scene comes from a German fencing manual painted in 1467, and the man who commissioned the paintings was a professional instructor whose actual job, his real paying work, was preparing ordinary people to fight to the death in front of a judge. That was a legal proceeding, a trial. Somewhere under all of it sat a genuine belief, held by kings and bishops and farmers alike, that God was watching and that God would not allow a liar to win. So when two people had a dispute that could not be settled by witnesses, the court could order them into a fenced square of sand and let heaven sort it out. The loser had, by definition, lied under oath. And a person who lied under oath in a capital case did not simply lose. He was hauled off the sand, sometimes still bleeding, sometimes already a corpse, and handed to the executioner to be hanged or beheaded or burned depending on the accusation. Over the next while I want to walk you through the fullest accounts we have of these fights, the actual documented ones, blow by blow where the chronicles allow it, and I will warn you now that the chronicles allow quite a lot. Men had their skulls opened and their eyes thumbed out of their heads in front of dukes. A knight died on the sand with his testicles torn. A woman stood beside a stake, watching her husband fight, knowing the fire was for her if he went down. Before any of that, a quick hello. Welcome in. Whether you are brand new here or one of the regulars who falls asleep to this stuff, and honestly, no judgment either way. This topic was suggested by one of our subscribers. If you have any topics you would like us to cover in a future video, always drop them in the comments. Also, while we're at it, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching or listening from. I like scrolling through those. It is one of the better parts of doing this. A huge thank you, as always, to the Patreon supporters and the YouTube members. You are the reason a video this long can exist at all. If you want to join them, all the links to support the channel are down in the description and in the pinned comment. Alright, back to the sand. The roots of all this go deep into the law codes of the early Germanic kingdoms, the peoples who carved up Western Europe after Rome came apart. Trial by combat shows up in the written law of the Burgundians around the year 500, under a king named Gundobad, and his reasoning survives in the text. Men were swearing false oaths constantly, he complained. Oaths were how disputes got settled. One party swore on holy objects with a crowd of oath helpers backing him up, and Gundobad had noticed that his subjects were perfectly happy to perjure themselves in bulk. His solution was blunt. If the accuser refused to accept the other side's oath, the two of them could take it to the sword, and God would identify the perjurer personally. He even extended it to witnesses. Under Burgundian law, you could be dragged into a death match for testifying, an arrangement that must have done wonders for witness turnout. The Lombards in Italy wrote dueling into their code under King Rothari in 643, though the practice among them was clearly older. Around 630, a Lombard queen named Gundeberga was accused of plotting against her own husband, and the matter was resolved when a champion fought on her behalf and killed the accuser, an event often counted as the first recorded trial by combat on Italian soil. A queen could not very well fight, so a man swung a sword for her honor, and when her man won, the accusation was legally dead. Nobody asked for evidence afterward. The verdict had come from above. The Alemanni, up along the Rhine, prescribed combat in the early 700s for arguments over land boundaries. Two families disputing where one field ended and another began would each grab a handful of the actual soil in question, place it between the fighters, touch it with the tips of their swords, and then one man from each family would try to kill the other. Whoever survived owned the dirt. The dirt was right there on the sand, watching, so to speak, while men bled over it. Kings even used the duel to settle questions of pure law, with no crime anywhere in sight. In 938, Otto the Great faced a dry inheritance dispute that had split his Saxon nobles, whether grandsons whose fathers had died young should share in their grandfather's estate alongside their living uncles. A room full of magnates could have argued it for a year. Otto, according to the chronicler Widukind, declined to let them, and ordered the abstract question itself put to combat, champion against champion, one man fighting for the rights of orphaned grandsons everywhere, the other for the uncles. The grandson's champion won, and his victory was written into the general law of the land. Every fatherless grandchild in Saxony inherited, from that day on the strength of one hired man's sword arm on one particular morning. The chronicler adds that the king preferred this method precisely so the nobles would not have to wrangle, as if bloodshed were the tidier option, and by the standards of the age, maybe it was. The reasoning underneath was better than it looks from here. Medieval courts had no police and no forensic science, and a crime often had no witness at all, so some accusations simply could not be proven or disproven by human means. A murder in a deep forest. Treason whispered behind a closed door. The oath was the standard tool, but oaths could be bought, and everyone knew it. The judicial duel offered a way out of the deadlock, and the people involved understood it as an ordeal in the fullest religious sense, a formal appeal to the highest possible court. God saw the forest. God heard the whisper. Put the two claimants under arms, and the truth would announce itself in blood. A theologian could point to David and Goliath, single combat as divine verdict, the giant with the sword and the shepherd with the sling, and the shepherd walking away with the giant's head in his hand. If God did that for David, he would do it for any honest man in a Frankish courtyard. The corollary was merciless. Since losing proved you had lied, the defeat itself merely opened your punishment. The duel established guilt, and then the ordinary penalty for the crime kicked in. A man accused of murder who lost his duel had, in the eyes of the court, just been convicted of murder, so up he went on the gallows, assuming the fight had left enough of him to hang. A defeated accuser had committed false witness in a capital matter and paid accordingly. Every romantic image of dueling you have ever absorbed breaks on that point. A man who lost a judicial duel was very often dragged off the field semi-conscious, stripped of his armor, and strung up in front of the same crowd, his property confiscated, his family disgraced for a generation. Courts in some places hanged the corpse even when the man was already dead. The body had to go on the gibbet. Procedure was procedure. Once the practice hardened into custom, it grew rituals, and the rituals show you exactly how seriously the whole business was taken. A judicial duel was choreographed like a coronation. The fight typically took place inside a list, a fenced enclosure often 60 feet on a side, floored with sand or bare earth, ringed by a barrier to keep the crowd out and the fighters in. Judges sat on a raised platform. In the great cases, the king himself presided. Before a single blow, both combatants knelt and swore a series of oaths, hands on the Gospels or on the relics of saints, actual bones and blood and scraps of cloth from holy bodies, brought out in reliquaries for the occasion. Each man swore his cause was true. Each man swore in a wonderfully specific clause that appears again and again that he carried no charm or enchanted herb upon his body, no witchcraft of any sort, and that he placed his trust in God and his own two hands alone. People genuinely worried that a guilty man might cheat heaven with a magic ring. The oath closed that loophole. Now sorcery would itself be perjury, and God would strike the cheater down twice over. The German law book, called the Sachsenspiegel, compiled around 1230, gets granular about the staging. Combatants were to fight in linen and leather, heads bare, feet bare, hands covered only by thin gloves. A naked sword in one hand, a shield of wood and leather in the other. The judge was instructed to position the two men so that they shared the sun, meaning the light was split evenly between them, so no one fought blind with the glare in his eyes. Somebody thought about that, wrote it down, made it law. Fairness in every detail, right up to the moment one man opened the other's head. The day itself moved like a liturgy. In the formal versions, a combatant spent the night before in vigil, confessed his sins at dawn, and heard Mass. He might be standing before God in person by mid-afternoon, and it paid to arrive with the account settled. He was escorted to the field in procession, presented himself at the barrier at the appointed hour, and was called 3 times by the heralds. Failing to appear by the third call meant losing the case outright, judged a coward by default, with all the penalties of defeat and none of the bleeding. Officials measured the weapons against each other so neither sword outreached the other by a finger's width, inspected the men for hidden charms or concealed blades, and proclaimed the terms aloud. Some ordinances required each fighter to swear one final oath at the barrier itself, on the missal, with his hand on the very ground he was about to fight over if the case concerned land. And in more than one account, the practical arrangements for afterward stood in plain view the whole time. The gallows for the loser built at the edge of the field before anyone had lost, the executioner waiting in his place among the officials like any other officer of the court, which he was. A man walking into the lists walked past the instrument of his own possible execution on the way in. Nobody considered this in poor taste. It was simply the schedule, laid out where everyone could see it. Weapons tracked social class, and the difference was pointed. Knights fought as knights, with lance and longsword and axe and dagger, often in full armor, sometimes beginning on horseback. Commoners were forbidden noble weapons. They got clubs, batons, staves, sometimes tipped with iron or horn, and rectangular shields, and in place of plate, they wore suits of hardened leather. In parts of France and the Low Countries, the custom for common duels ran further. The fighters had their heads shaved, their bodies sewn into tight leather, and their skin greased with fat so that neither man could get a grip on the other. And then their hands were dusted with ash so they could still hold their weapons. Two bald, greased men in sewn leather beating each other with sticks in a sandpit, with a duke watching from a pavilion. That was a court of law in session. Timing mattered too. The fight had to begin before noon and finish by sunset, or by the coming out of the stars, and if the defendant could stay alive on his feet until the stars showed, in some jurisdictions he won outright, on the theory that God had preserved him through the whole day. A fighter could end it at any moment by speaking a single word. In England the word was craven. Say it, and the fight stopped, and you had just formally confessed that your cause was false. A defendant who cried craven in a criminal matter was hanged on the spot. A man who cried it in a land dispute kept his life but lost the case and was declared infamous, stripped of his legal standing, unable ever again to bear witness or serve on a jury. The law had a phrase for it. He lost his law. He walked out of the lists alive and legally erased. The stakes wrapped around the families too. When a woman brought an accusation that ended in combat and her side lost, she faced the penalty for false accusation in a capital case, and for a woman in much of medieval Europe, that penalty was fire. Hold that in your head. We are going to see it standing beside a scaffold in Paris before we are done. And when the accusation was treason, the defeated man's lands and titles were forfeit to the crown, his heirs disinherited, his name attainted. One bad afternoon on the sand could delete a family from the nobility. With the machinery in view, the actual fights are where this stops being legal history and becomes something closer to horror, and the earliest fight with real meat on the record comes out of Saxony in the late 900s. It may be the most quietly disturbing case in the whole file. The man who won was executed anyway. Gero was a Saxon count, lord of a place called Alsleben, a man of rank in the orbit of the young emperor Otto II. At some point in the late 970s, he made enemies of two powerful men, the Archbishop of Magdeburg and a margrave named Dietrich, and through their influence a warrior named Waldo came forward and accused Gero of plotting against the emperor. The exact substance of the charge has not survived, and that gap has its own chill to it. A man died over this, and we cannot even say what it was. Gero denied everything. The matter went to combat, fought before the emperor himself. Our best account comes from the chronicler Thietmar of Merseburg, and Thietmar had an unusually close view. His own father and uncle were the men given custody of the accused count before the fight. The two combatants met, and Gero struck Waldo twice in the neck, heavy blows, the sort that end fights. Waldo stayed up. He answered with a stroke to Gero's head that left the count staggering, 2 days to continue, and at that point Waldo was the winner. He walked off the field. He began to unbuckle his armor. The fight done, his accusation vindicated by heaven, and as he stood there loosening straps, the 2 neck wounds finished their work. Waldo dropped dead beside his own equipment. Now the court had a theological problem. The accuser had won the fight and then immediately died of it. Whose side was God on, exactly? A defensible answer was that the survivor was the man heaven had preserved, and by that logic, Gero should have walked free. The archbishop and the margrave pressed the other interpretation on the young emperor. Waldo had prevailed within the lists, they argued, so the verdict stood, and the verdict was treason. Otto agreed. Gero was beheaded that same evening before the sun was fully down, while the man who technically beat him was being laid out for burial a few yards away. Thietmar records that people at the time considered it a plain injustice, and he was in a position to know what people were saying, given that his family had housed the condemned man in his final days. The chronicler even preserves the timing complaint, that the execution was rushed through against custom before proper deliberation, as though the count's enemies understood that a night of reflection might cost them their verdict. At least 7 separate medieval chronicles took the trouble to record the affair, and the sources do not even agree on the year, some pointing to 978, most to the 11th of August, 979. One last detail survives, and it is the one that stays with me. Gero had a daughter, Athela. After the execution, the archbishop kept her father's severed head, and she got it back for burial only after signing over a portion of the family estates to the church. She had to buy the head. The man who helped engineer her father's death set the price, and the price was land, and she paid it. From Saxony, the trail runs west, about 150 years forward, into Flanders, and into the aftermath of one of the most shocking political murders of the entire Middle Ages. In March of 1127, Charles the Good, Count of Flanders, went to morning prayers at the Church of Saint Donation in Bruges. He knelt at the altar, and while he was praying, giving out pennies to the poor with one hand, a group of conspirators from a powerful clerical family called the Arembolds came up behind him and hacked him to death on the altar steps with swords. His brains ended up on the floor of his own church. The men who did it had reasons, a feud over their family's legal status, but the killing of a pious count in mid-prayer detonated across Europe, and the vengeance that followed was inventive, and it played out in public. We know all of it in extraordinary detail thanks to a notary in Bruges named Galbert, a church clerk who lived through the whole crisis and kept what amounts to a running journal day by day, while the town around him tore itself apart. Galbert wrote down things chroniclers usually smooth over. The ringleader of the murder, a man named Bertolf, was captured, tortured, and hanged in a marketplace with a dog fastened beside him, and the crowd was encouraged to participate as he died. Another conspirator was broken and then strangled with the intestines of a dog, the animal's guts wound around his throat, a form of execution chosen specifically for its degradation. A large group of the besieged conspirators, 28 of them, surrendered on terms in the Count's own castle, and the King of France, who had come to supervise, had them taken up to the top of the tower one at a time and thrown off. Galba describes them being launched from the battlements in sequence, the leaders first, their bodies breaking on the ground below, while the next man was walked up the stairs. One conspirator, Bertulf's nephew, was tied to a wheel and hoisted up a pole in the square, where he hung in the air while people pelted him, and Galbert reports he survived up there for a full day, exposed, until he finally died with crows around him. Amid all that, the judicial duel arrives almost as a mercy, and it involved a knight named Guy of Steenvoorde. Guy had been one of Charles the Good's own men, and he was well connected, a landholder, respected. His problem was his marriage. His wife was the niece of the traitor Bertulf, the same Bertulf who ended his life in the marketplace beside the dog, and in the poisoned atmosphere after the murder. Marriage into that family was as good as a confession. Guy was accused of complicity in the Count's death. He denied it, and no witnesses could settle it, and so a loyalist knight named Herman the Iron stepped forward and offered his body to prove the accusation. The nickname was earned, apparently, though on the day it was Guy who looked the stronger man. They fought in April of 1127, on horseback to start. Guy got the better of the opening. He unhorsed Herman, put him on the ground, and pinned him down with his lance, riding over him, controlling him, a position most fights do not come back from. Herman, flat on his back under a mounted opponent, did the one thing available to him. He got his sword into the belly of Guy's horse and opened it up. The animal came apart above him, guts down, and collapsed. And now both men were on the ground, and the fight became a grinding, exhausted mess. Galbert says they went at each other with swords until neither had the arms left to swing, and then they threw the swords away and simply fought with their bodies. Iron gauntlets into faces, wrestling in the churned dirt beside a dying horse. Real armored combat had exactly that texture, by the way, and it will keep showing up. Armor works. Swords skid off it, so fights between armored men collapse into grappling and exhaustion, one man trying to get a knee on the other's chest, and the killing, when it comes, is close enough to smell. Herman went down. He lay on his back on the earth, apparently finished, and Guy dropped onto him and lay across his upper body, driving the gauntlets into his face, into his mouth, working to smother and batter him into submission. Galbert, who heard all this from eyewitnesses, reaches for a classical comparison here, the giant Antaeus, who drew strength from touching the ground. While Guy lay on top of him, confident, already the winner in his own mind, Herman was resting, recovering, quietly, underneath. Then his hand moved. He reached down between Guy's legs, under the skirt of his mail, seized him by the testicles, gripped, and with everything left in his body, he tore and heaved in a single motion, throwing Guy off him and breaking him at the same time. Galbert says the grip failed all the lower parts of the body, a notary's careful way of describing a man whose groin has been torn apart through sheer force of hand. Guy of Steenvoorde was finished. He lay on the sand ruined, and by the logic of the ordeal, guilty, God having just spoken through Herman's fist. The court did not let him bleed out in peace. Guy was taken from the field and hanged on the gallows alongside the other conspirators, a knight strung up with his wounds still open, his marriage having doomed him as much as any evidence ever did. Whether he actually helped plan the Count's murder, no one can say. Galbert himself never quite commits. The record preserves only the method of his conviction, a torn groin in a courtyard, ratified as the judgment of God, followed by a rope. Herman the Iron came away with his reputation gilded. His winning move, the deliberate crushing of another man's genitals as a finishing technique, went into the chronicle without a word of criticism and, honestly, without a word of surprise. Fights like this had no fouls. A judicial duel recognized one rule in the end, and the rule was that somebody had to be destroyed. That grim flexibility, the way these fights sanctioned literally anything the human body could do to another human body, is going to be a running theme, and you can find it codified almost cheerfully in the fight books we will get to later. England comes first, though. English records preserve some of the ugliest fights of all, and one case involving a royal standard-bearer who, in the middle of his duel, saw a dead man watching him from the air. Trial by battle was actually an import in England. The Anglo-Saxons never used it. They ran their courts on oaths and ordeals of hot iron and water, and the duel arrived in 1066 with the Normans as part of the general package of conquest. The earliest recorded English case dates to 1077, and within a couple of generations the practice had settled into English law at every level, from land disputes to murder appeals, and it produced, in 1163, the strange downfall of one of the most prominent men in the kingdom. Henry of Essex was the royal constable and hereditary standard-bearer of England, the man whose literal job was to carry the king's banner into battle. In 1157 he had done exactly that, during Henry II's campaign in Wales, and it went catastrophically wrong. The English column was ambushed in a wooded pass at Coleshill, arrows coming out of the trees, men dropping, and in the panic Henry of Essex threw down the royal standard and shouted that the king was dead. He was wrong. The king was alive, and the sight of the standard falling nearly collapsed the whole army. The campaign survived, and so, for 6 years, did Henry of Essex's career, until a baron named Robert de Montfort formally accused him of treason for that moment in the pass, and demanded proof by battle. The two men met on an island in the Thames near the Abbey at Reading, with the king watching from the bank. Essex was a soldier of long experience, but by the account that survives, the fight turned against him for a reason no training covers. Mid-combat, he looked toward the edge of the lists and saw, standing in the air, the figure of Saint Edmund, the martyred king, armed and glaring at him with what the account calls an angry countenance, and beside the saint stood a second figure, a knight named Gilbert de Serreville, and Gilbert was a dead man, and Essex knew exactly why. Years earlier, the story went, Essex's own wife had accused Gilbert of soliciting her, an accusation she had invented, and on the strength of it, Essex had Gilbert chained and tortured until he died in his custody. An innocent man, destroyed inside Essex's own household, on his order. Now, in the middle of a sword fight for his life, with his arms burning and a crowd roaring, Essex saw that man watching him. He started missing his strokes. He fought, in the words of the account, more like a man dodging his own memory than a man dodging a sword, and Robert de Montfort beat him down onto the ground and left him there, opened up and motionless. The judgment was treason, and everything followed automatically. Essex's lands went to the crown, and the office and the name went with them. Since he appeared to be dead, the king granted the monks of the abbey permission to take the body and bury it. The monks carried him off the island, and while they were preparing him for the grave, the corpse started breathing. Essex had survived his own judicial death. Legally, though, the man he had been no longer existed, and so, with a certain logic, he stopped being him. He took vows and lived out the rest of his life as a monk in that same abbey, the former standard-bearer of England's sweeping cloisters, and years later he personally told his story to a visiting monk named Jocelyn of Brakelond, vision and all, and Jocelyn wrote it down, and that is how we have it. Essex apparently spoke of the duel as the moment God settled accounts for Gilbert de Séraville. Whether you take the vision as fact or as a guilty man's memory reorganizing itself in a monastery, the account came from his own mouth, and he had decades in the cloister to think about the man in the air beside St. Edmund. Not every defeated Englishman got a monastery, and a case from the court rolls of 1221 shows what the ordinary tariff looked like, written down in the same dry hand that recorded land transfers. Thomas of Elderfield was a Worcestershire man of small property, who had once worked in the household of a neighbour, and the neighbour's wife had drawn him into an affair, and years later, long after Thomas had repented of it and moved on, the husband, a man named George, still carried the grudge. The two eventually came to blows in a quarrel. George came off worse, and George saw his opening. He went to the justices and appealed Thomas of felony, of wounding him by ambush, dressing a private brawl up as a crime of violence, and when the case came before the travelling royal court at Worcester, the judges sent it to battle. The two middle-aged neighbours fought through most of a day with staves, and the account describes Thomas holding on hour after hour until a blow ruined one of his eyes, and George put him down and forced his surrender. Under the law that governed such appeals, the beaten man was at the winner's mercy as to life, and George graciously conceded the life. The court took the rest. The penalty short of hanging for a man convicted this way was mutilation, and the sentence was carried out at once, in public, by enthusiastic volunteers from among George's kinsmen, and I will give it to you as the record gives it. Thomas of Elderfield was blinded and castrated on the field. His eyes were put out and his testicles cut away, and the account adds a detail I would not repeat if it were not in the sources. The severed parts were tossed to the bystanders, and the young men amused themselves kicking them back and forth, using the eyes and testicles of a living, screaming man as playthings while he was carried off, presumed as good as dead. He survived. Beggared and dark, he lived on charity and prayed at the shrine of St. Wulfstan, and the monks of Worcester later recorded, among their saints' miracles, that Thomas's sight was restored to him, new eyes growing where the old were destroyed, smaller than the originals and differently coloured, the record notes, with a clerk's care for detail. You may make what you like of the miracle, the mutilation, at least, sits in the legal record as plainly as a fine for trespass, one more Tuesday in the operation of English justice, and the woman whose marriage started it all never appears in the documents again. Essex fought his duel as a nobleman, with a sword before a king, and even in defeat he landed in the relative comfort of a monastery. Slide down the social ladder, and the English duel loses every scrap of that dignity. At the bottom of the system sat a class of fighters called approvers, and the approver system might be the most nakedly cruel legal machine in this entire story. It worked like this. A man is caught for a felony, robbery, say, and he is going to hang, no question. The evidence is right there. English law offered him one exit. He could confess before the coroner, turn King's evidence, and accuse his former accomplices, and the procedure gave him 40 days in prison, at the King's expense, to name his names, each accusation sworn and enrolled. Then came the collection work. Every man he named who denied it could put him to proof, and the proof was his body, in a duel to the death against the man he accused. Win, and that man hangs. Then the next accusation, the next duel. By tradition, an approver who fought and won 5 times could earn his life, usually on condition of leaving the realm forever, walking to a port barefoot with a cross in his hand. In practice, the Crown fed and housed these men for months, paid them a wage, 3 halfpence a day in the cases we have records for, and used them as disposable prosecution weapons, and then very often hanged them anyway when their usefulness ran out. One case from about 1440 tells you everything about the odds. An approver fought his first accused man and beat him, and that man went to the gallows at Tyburn. His second accused man exercised his right to choose a jury instead of a duel, and the jury acquitted him. The approver had now failed to make good all his accusations, and so the approver was hanged. He won his fight and died on the rope regardless. Meanwhile, an innocent defendant who fought back too well had his own problem, because killing a king's approver in the lists could itself be treated as slaying a Crown witness. The machine was built so that nearly every path out of it ended on a gallows, and the fights it staged were, by design, the most degraded in England. One of those fights got written down in the middle of the 1450s by a London skinner named William Gregory, a merchant who served as sheriff and later mayor of the city, and who kept a chronicle on the side. His account of an approver's duel is, I think, the single most physically revolting description of judicial combat that survives from medieval England, and it follows here close to whole, with the rough edges left on. The approver in question had been working for the Crown for nearly 3 years. He drew his 3 halfpence a day, and in that time he had accused 18 men, 18 former friends and companions, many of whom presumably went to the rope on his word. Gregory has no sympathy for him at all. He calls the man false, and he calls the accused man in this particular fight a meek innocent, so you know where the chronicler's heart sits. The accused, a craftsman with no fighting background, chose battle rather than a jury, or was cornered into it, and the two were prepared according to the custom for common combatants. The weapons were batons of ash, and at the end of each baton was fixed a spike of ram's horn, filed down, Gregory says, to be as sharp as it could possibly be made, no armor, clothing of leather, heads bare, and both men fasting. The rules for these fights denied them food and drink from the night before, and if either grew thirsty during the combat, the Chronicle states flatly, he was to drink his own urine. That was the provision the law made for them. Two starving men with horn-tipped clubs on what Gregory calls the sorriest and most wretched patch of green that might be found anywhere about, an ugly venue chosen on purpose. These fights were staged to be shameful. They beat each other with the batons until the batons were gone, broken or lost, and the rules had an answer for that too. Weapons spent, the combatants were to continue with their hands, their fists, their nails, their teeth, their feet and their legs, and that is a direct list from the period, an official inventory of what remained permissible, meaning everything. So the two men closed and went at each other like animals, and Gregory watched it happen. They bit. He describes them tearing at each other with their teeth, so that the leather of their clothing and the flesh underneath ripped away together, mouthfuls of a living man. The false approver got the innocent man down and, on the ground, bit into his genitals through the leather. The accused man, in that state of pain, somehow got up onto his knees, seized the approver's face, took the man's nose in his teeth, and bit down, and while the approver was screaming through that, the innocent man put a thumb into his eye and pushed. The approver broke. He cried off, gave up the fight, called out for mercy while a man's thumb was in his eye socket, and in surrendering he confessed, out loud, before the judges and the crowd, that his accusations were lies. 18 men, he admitted, he had appealed falsely. Whatever number of them had already been hanged on his word stayed hanged. The sentence took effect immediately. The approver was given a priest, confessed his sins, and was hanged then and there. And Gregory closes the man's story with a line of business-like piety, of whose soul God have mercy, amen, and moves on. The victor was carried off the field alive and vindicated, his innocence certified by heaven and by the wreckage of the man he had half eaten. Gregory adds one more sentence about him, and it is the strangest line in the Chronicle. The winner, he says, afterward became a hermit, and within a short while died. Nothing more. A man proved his innocence with his teeth in another man's face, walked away with his life, and found he could not carry it. He withdrew from every human being he knew, and was dead soon after. The court got its verdict. God, presumably, got his glory. And both combatants ended up in the ground within, it seems, a year or two of each other, one by rope and one by whatever kills a hermit who has seen what he has seen. A decade before that fight, London had watched another one, better remembered, because Shakespeare later put a version of it on stage. In 1446, an armourer's apprentice named John Davy accused his own master, William Catour, of speaking treason against King Henry VI. Master against servant, with the servant as accuser, and the matter went to battle at Smithfield before a large crowd. Catour was the stronger and more experienced man, an armourer, someone who handled weapons for a living, and by most estimates, he should have won comfortably. His friends destroyed him. Convinced the outcome was safe, they spent the hours before the fight toasting his certain victory and pressing wine and ale on him, and Catour came into the lists drunk enough that it decided the matter before the king's judges with his life on the table. His apprentice, sober and terrified, beat him and killed him on the field. And since the verdict of the fight was treason, Catour's story did not end with his death. His body was drawn, hanged and beheaded, and his head went up on London Bridge, the standard traitor's display, spiked above the traffic for the birds. A tradesman who may have said something reckless in his workshop, or may have said nothing at all, ended as a skull over the Thames because his friends threw him a party. The apprentice walked away. Chroniclers passing the story along mostly spare a line of disgust for the drinking companions, and it is hard to argue with them. Not everyone had to fight in person, and the exceptions built an entire profession. Women, the elderly, the maimed, priests, children, heirs to disputed land, all of these could appear by champion, a substitute who took the field in their place, and in civil matters, property disputes especially, hiring a champion became standard practice for anyone with money. In theory, in England, a champion in a land case was supposed to be a witness to the claim, a man who knew the land personally. In practice, this was a polite fiction that everybody stepped around, and a market in professional fighters grew up in the shadow of the courts. Records survive of retainers, actual contracts. In 1276, a bishop's household accounts show a payment keeping a man named Thomas of Bridges on standby as the bishop's champion, an annual fee just to have him available, with more due each time he actually fought. Great monasteries kept champions the way they kept lawyers. When two abbeys fell into a dispute over fishing rights, one of them hired 7 champions at once, at what the record calls great cost, apparently to corner the local supply so the other abbey would have nothing left to hire. Monks did that. Men of prayer, hoarding mercenary duelists over fish. The champions themselves lived strange, despised lives. Legally and socially, they ranked near the bottom. In France, they were classed with prostitutes and were subject to the same civic disabilities. In Germany, law books grouped hired fighters with actors, jugglers, and those born out of wedlock, people considered unworthy of law, barred from testimony and from inheritance, their children's rights clouded by the father's trade. And the trade could cost more than reputation. A champion fought under the same theology as everyone else, so when he lost, he had personally perjured himself before God, hired mouth or not. A defeated champion who survived the fight paid the perjurer's price, a heavy fine and the loss of his law. And in various times and places, the tariff on a losing champion was written directly on his body. A hand struck off, or a foot, so that he could never fight for pay again, and everyone who saw him would know what he was. In criminal matters, where a principal would have hanged, his champion could hang. Every fight was a coin flip with mutilation on one face. Some men did it anyway, for years, career fighters moving from dispute to dispute, and the records show at least one cheerfully switching sides mid-litigation when the opposing party offered better money, faith in divine verdicts, apparently coexisting just fine with an open bidding process. One championship, at least, came with honor attached, and it outlived everything else in this story. The kings of England kept a hereditary king's champion, an office held for centuries by the de Mocy family, whose duty came due exactly once a reign. At the coronation banquet, the champion rode on horseback in full armor straight into Westminster Hall among the dining nobility, and a herald proclaimed that if any person denied the new sovereign's right to the crown, here was his challenger, and the champion threw down his gauntlet on the floor of the hall. 3 times, at 3 stations, the gauntlet went down, and the king drank to his champion from a gold cup and handed it over as the fee. No one ever picked the glove up in all those centuries, and the last time an armoured daimoke performed the ride was at the coronation banquet of George IV in the year 1821, 2 years, notice, after Parliament had abolished trial by battle itself, the ghost outlasting the body. Northern Europe, meanwhile, had been running its own version of all this since before the law codes, and the Norse variant is worth a detour, the sagas preserving fight scenes of a special ugliness. The Icelanders and Norwegians called it holmgang, island-going, from the habit of staging the fights on small islands or on a marked patch of ground the fighters were forbidden to leave. A cloak or hide was staked out, boundaries scratched around it, and stepping off the cloth mid-fight was itself a defeat, cowardice made geometric. Any free man could challenge another over land, over an insult, over a woman, and refusal was barely an option. A man who declined was named a nithing, an unperson, a coward outside honor, and in some tellings outside law, a status many Norsemen genuinely considered worse than dying. The fight came 3 days to a week after the challenge. Rules were recited aloud beforehand, and one saga preserves the ceremony nearly whole, the formal speaking of the holmgang law over the ground, the hide 5 ells square pegged down at the corners with ritual pegs set in a prescribed way that the saga's own narrator admits was already half forgotten in his day, hazel rods marking the outer boundaries in the old manor. The same hazel-staked squares that gave the North its phrase for a formal battlefield. A sacrificial bull stood by, brought to the fight beforehand, and the man who won the duel slaughtered it afterward, blood answering blood, the animal's death sealing the man's victory. The gods were the audience here rather than the Christian heaven. But you can feel the same shape underneath, a fenced square and a killing offered upward for ratification. Each man was allowed a set number of shields, commonly 3, because a sword ruins a wooden shield fast, and the blows went in turns, one strikes, the other strikes, hacking through shield after shield until someone ran out of wood and started running out of blood. In the older form, the fight ran until death or maiming, and in Norway the winner could claim everything the dead man had owned, his land and goods, the lot. That last provision broke the system, since it turned dueling into a legal instrument for robbery. The sagas complain about it openly. Professional duelists and berserkers, large violent men with no farms of their own, would ride up to a prosperous landowner and challenge him for his property or for his wife on any pretext or none, knowing the man faced a choice between fighting a killer and being publicly unpersoned. Egil's saga has its hero step in against one of these men, a berserker named Ljot the Pale, who had challenged a young farmer for exactly this purpose. Egil, being Egil, took the fight himself, chanted verses while he waited, and ended it by cutting off Ljot's leg at the knee, and the saga notes with satisfaction that Ljot's death was mourned by no one. Another saga follows two poets, Gunnlaug Serpent Tongue and Hrafn, rivals for the same woman whose feud outgrew Iceland itself. Their first formal holmgang was stopped after a single exchange, and the sagas say it disgusted the assembled chieftains enough that Iceland banned the practice outright around 1006. The two men simply sailed to Norway and finished it there, outside the ban. Gunnlaug cut Hrafn's leg from under him and offered to end the fight, a man on one leg being done. Hrafn asked only for a drink of water. Gunnlaug carried it to him in his own helmet, and Hrafn, taking the water with one hand, swung his sword with the other and split open the skull of the man, showing him mercy. Gunnlaug still managed to kill him before collapsing and died of the head wound shortly after. Two poets, one woman, both men dead in a foreign clearing, and the woman married someone else. Norway banned the holmgang around 1014. Sweden, for whatever reason, kept legal dueling on its books for another 6 centuries. Spain, in the same rough era, staged the most operatic judicial combat of them all, and the Castilian chronicles and epics kept polishing it for centuries. So take the details with the awareness that poets got their hands on this one early. In 1072, King Sancho II of Castile was besieging the walled city of Zamora, held against him by his own sister, when a nobleman named Velido Dolfos slipped out of the gates, gained the king's trust as a pretended defector, and murdered him, running him through from behind with a spear at a moment when the king was alone and defenseless, then galloping back inside the walls before anyone could react. A royal killing, an assassin sheltered behind the city gates, and no way to reach him. So, a Castilian knight named Diego Ordóñez rode up under the walls in full armor and did something Castilian law actually provided for. He challenged the city, all of it. He pronounced the formal accusation of treason against Zamora entire, against its knights and its councilmen, its women and its children, its dead in their graves and its babies yet unborn, against its bread, its water, and its wine, a curse with paperwork behind it. Custom answered a challenge of that size with a price. A man who defied a whole city had to make his accusation good against 5 champions, one after another, fresh man after fresh man, until he had beaten all 5 or died. An old lord of the city, Arias Gonzalo, claimed the defense for his own family and put forward his sons. The first son to enter the lists against Ordóñez was killed there, by most accounts with his head split, though one tradition gives the dying young man a last blind stroke from the ground. Another son followed his brother in and died in the same sand. The third bout ended in a lawyer's riddle. That son drove his sword into Ordóñez's horse as he himself took his death wound, and the maddened animal bolted and carried Ordóñez over the boundary of the lists, out of the field, and leaving the field meant forfeit. Ordóñez roared to be allowed to continue against the remaining sons. The judges retired, contemplated a dead champion on the sand, a live one carried off by a dying horse, a father with 2 sons left to spend, and never issued a verdict at all. 3 young men were in the ground. The city was neither condemned nor cleared, and the record simply stops, which may be the most honest ending any of these fights ever got. Castile, a few years later, extended the method somewhere even stranger into theology itself. In the 1070s, the papacy was pressing Spain to abandon its ancient homegrown liturgy, the old Mozarabic rite its churches had used since the Visigoths, and adopt the Roman rite used everywhere else, and the kingdom split over it, clergy against clergy, court against pope, ordinary people attached to the prayers their grandparents had died hearing. King Alfonso VI resolved the deadlock the Castilian way. He ordered trial by combat, 1 armoured knight to fight for the Roman books and 1 for the Toledan, and the 2 men went at each other in earnest before the court, actual blood shed over the correct wording of the Mass. The Toledan champion won, and by every rule we have traced across this whole video that should have settled it, heaven itself endorsing the old Spanish prayers. Alfonso, whose queen and whose political situation both pulled toward Rome, decided heaven deserved a recount. The chronicles say the 2 rival service books were then thrown together onto a great fire, a second ordeal to overrule the first, and the Toledan book, in the version Spaniards told for centuries, leaped unburnt out of the flames, winning again, at which point the king reportedly kicked it back into the fire and imposed the Roman rite regardless. The story comes down through chronicle and tradition with obvious polish on it, and you can decide for yourself where the history ends and the grievance begins. What nobody invented is the underlying event, a Christian kingdom that considered sword fighting a legitimate instrument for settling the text of the Mass, and a king who accepted God's verdict the way most litigants do, only when it agreed with him. The German-speaking lands, meanwhile, took us back to that man in the pit and his wife with the stone, since they developed the judicial duel further than anywhere else, kept it later than almost anywhere else, and produced the only surviving instruction manuals for it. The fight books, the Fechtbücher, are among the strangest documents the Middle Ages left behind. Fencing masters, professional teachers of violence, compiled illustrated guides to every form of combat a client might face in the lists, and the most famous of these masters was a Swabian named Hans Talhofer, active through the middle of the 1400s. Talhofer made his living exactly where this whole subject lives. He trained men who had been ordered to trial by combat. He served as a technical advisor at judicial duels, and at least once he appears in court records on the wrong side of the law himself, implicated in a killing. His masterwork, produced in 1467 for a German count, runs to hundreds of painted illustrations, and paging through it is like touring an anatomy of sanctioned murder. Armored men driving daggers through the eye slits of each other's helmets, techniques for snapping an opponent's neck once you have him on the ground, wrestling moves that end with a knee on the chest and a blade going in at the armpit, the groin, the throat, all the places plate armor cannot cover, specialized dueling shields taller than a man with iron horns at each end for hooking and stabbing. The paintings are neat, almost serene, little mustached figures calmly disemboweling one another with instructional captions, and every single technique existed so that a legal proceeding could reach its verdict. And in the middle of the manual sits the sequence between husband and wife. German custom, recorded in several law books, allowed judicial combat between a man and a woman in certain accusations, and because the sexes were unequal in strength, the law equalized them with a shovel. The man was placed in a pit dug to his waist, sometimes with one arm bound to his body, armed with a club or mace. The woman moved freely on the ground above, armed with a stone of several pounds wrapped in her veil or knotted into the sleeve of her shift, a soft handle on a hard weight, a flail improvised from her own clothing. Talhofer's captions walk through the exchanges without a flicker of editorial feeling. The woman swings her stone at the man's head, and he catches the veil on his arm to drag her toward the pit. The man gets hold of her, pulls her down into the hole, and throws himself on top of her to strangle her. The woman gets behind him, wraps an arm around his throat, catches him by the groin with her other hand, and hauls him up out of the pit to finish him on the open ground. Both endings are illustrated. The manual takes no position on who deserves to win. The whole point of the exercise was that heaven would decide, and Talhofer's job was simply to make sure his client, whichever one hired him, was the instrument heaven found readiest. What was at stake in these fights is spelled out in the town laws, and the town laws are worse than the pictures. A statute from Augsburg dated 1276 deals with an accusation of rape brought by a woman with no witnesses, exactly the deadlock the duel existed to break. The accused man could swear his innocence, and the woman could accept the oath and drop the matter, or refuse it and demand combat, pit, stone, club, and all. And the statute names the price of losing. The defeated party was buried alive. A Bavarian law book from 1328 repeats the arrangement with different penalties, specifying the man fights with his left hand bound, and that if he loses, he is beheaded, while if she loses, her hand is struck off, the perjurer's hand, the one she swore her false oath with. Sit with that Augsburg provision for a moment. A woman assaulted in private with no witness in 1276 had a legal path to justice, and the path ran through a sand pit where she swung a rock at the head of the man who attacked her, knowing that if her arm failed, or her nerve broke, or the veil tore, the verdict would be that she had lied, and they would put her in the ground breathing. Scholars who have combed the records find only a single case anywhere in Europe, at Bern in 1288, where litigants of both sexes verifiably fought a matter out in person all the way to the end, so the pit duel seems to have lived mostly on parchment and in training yards, a procedure held in reserve rather than a weekly spectacle. The laws were real, though, sitting on the books, and every woman weighing an accusation in those towns made her decision underneath them. The manuals also correct the biggest lie the movies ever told about armored fighting, and the fights we have already walked through keep confirming it. Killing a man in plate was carpentry. Sword edges did almost nothing against steel, so the manuals teach half-swording, gripping your own blade partway down like a short spear, and steering the point into the slits and seams, the eye slots, the armpit, the inside of the elbow, the gap at the groin, and when even that failed, the manuals move on to using the sword's heavy pommel as a hammer against the helmet, denting the metal into the skull inside it. Fights between armored men ran long, and time itself became a weapon. A man in 60 pounds of harness on a warm day loses water by the pint. His own padding soaks through. His vision shrinks to a slot. His breathing fills the helmet with a wet echo, and after some minutes of it, his arms simply stop answering, and we watched exactly that kill Thomas Catrington without any single wound doing it. Even the winners crawled away wrecked. Men left the lists with fingers gone, faces caved on one side, wounds that closed over dirt and cloth and killed them by fever a month after the crowd had gone home. A slower verdict nobody entered in the record. And crowds there always were, a judicial duel being the best show a medieval town got, but at the great ones the audience itself came under discipline. At the most formal fights, spectators were placed under royal command to keep absolute silence while the combat ran. No shouting, no signalling, in some proclamations on pain of losing a hand, so thousands of people stood packed together in the cold, watching two men kill each other with less noise than a church service, and, at the Paris duel we are coming to, the quiet broke only for one wounded man's voice demanding over and over that the man pinned under him confess. Talhofer's name, as it happens, may brush against the most infamous common duel of the century, and that fight we can follow almost minute by minute, because two chroniclers stood in the crowd and both went home shaken. Valenciennes, in the county of Hainaut in the Low Countries, held from ancient charter a set of privileges, among them the right of sanctuary for killers and the right to settle homicide by combat under the town's own rules, and in the 1450s those old rights collided with real people. A tailor from Tournai named Mahiot Coquel killed a man. He never denied the killing. He claimed it was self-defense, an ambush gone wrong, and he fled to Valenciennes and took up the town's protection. The dead man had family, and among them a burgher of Valenciennes named Jacotin Pluvier, and Pluvier formally appealed Coquel of murder. Under the charter, the appeal gave him exactly two options: withdraw the accusation and pay the penalties for a false appeal, or prove it with his body in the town marketplace. He chose the marketplace. Then the waiting started, and the waiting is its own atrocity. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, overlord of the region and one of the most powerful princes in Europe, decided he wished to see the fight personally, and his schedule was full. So the two men were locked up in separate prisons and held there while the Duke finished his other business. For roughly 10 months. Two men under sentence of battle sitting in cells through an entire autumn, winter and spring, each knowing that on some unnamed future morning he would be taken out and set to killing the other for an audience of aristocrats. The town, at least, treated them as valuable property in the meantime. They were fed, exercised, and each was assigned a fencing master to prepare him at public expense. And here the record drops its strange little footnote. The master training Coquel is named in the chronicles simply as Hans, a German, and people have wondered ever since whether this Hans was Talhofer himself, the most famous German master of the age, whose services were exactly this. No one can show it either way. If it was him, his client's performance is about to become the worst advertisement of his career. The morning of the 20th of May, 1455, the marketplace of Valenciennes had been transformed. A great ring of lists stood in the square, sanded, with a pavilion for the Duke, who arrived with his son and a glittering crowd of courtiers, including the chroniclers Georges Chastelain and Mathieu d'Escouchy, and a young nobleman named Olivier de la Marche, all three of whom later wrote down what they watched. The two fighters were brought out for the preparation, engineered humiliation from the first touch of the razor. Shaved bald, barefoot, fingernails cut short, each man sewn into hardened leather and smeared over suit and skull with grease, so that neither could seize hold of the other, hands coated in ash for grip, and, by the account, sugar placed in their mouths against thirst. Each carried a stout baton of medlar wood and a shield with a painted red cross, and Chastelain notes they were made to carry the shields point up, inverted, a heraldic insult marking the whole affair as ignoble. Above the square, the great bell of the town rang the entire time, and Chastelain, who heard a lot of bells in his life, calls this one hideous to hear, tolling on and on over everything that followed, as though the town were burying someone who had not died yet. Pluvier, the accuser, was the bigger and stronger man, described as red-haired and powerfully built. Coquel was small. Whatever 10 months of training with Hans had given him, it came down to one trick, and he opened with it, snatching up sand from the floor of the lists and hurling it into Pluvier's face, then swinging in behind it and landing a blow that split Pluvier's forehead open. Blood came down over the big man's face, and for a moment the thing was even. It did not stay even. Pluvier closed through the sand and the blood, took the smaller man, and threw him onto the ground, and from that point forward what the Duke of Burgundy and his court watched was not recognizable as a duel. Pluvier landed on top and pinned him. He scooped up fistfuls of sand and packed them into Coquel's eyes and into his mouth, grinding it in, filling the openings of his face. Coquel, blinded, choking on grit, got one of Pluvier's fingers between his teeth and bit down to the bone, and Pluvier responded by driving his thumb into Coquel's eye socket and pressing until the pain forced the tailor's jaws open. Then he set about breaking him. He wrenched Coquel's arms up out of their sockets, jumped with his knees onto the man's back and chest over and over, and the accounts describe him working to snap the spine outright while the tailor screamed underneath him. And Coquel could scream. He stayed conscious through nearly all of it, and that part is hard to sit with. Blind, his mouth full of sand and blood, his arms ruined, he began crying out from under Pluvier's knees, and he was not crying to his opponent. He called out to the pavilion. He begged the Duke of Burgundy directly. By name, my noble Lord of Burgundy, I served you well in your war against Ghent. For God's sake, save my life. He had been the Duke's soldier. He shouted his service record while a man knelt on his spine. And Philip the Good, one of the richest and most powerful human beings alive, a man who could have stopped it with one raised finger, sat still and let it continue. The fight was being held under the town's chartered rights, and the charter did not permit even a duke to intervene once the combat had begun. Coquel gave up. He confessed the killing aloud, asked for a priest, and the priests came into the lists and heard his confession while he lay there wrecked in the sand. And then, with his confession complete and his soul attended to, the executioner took over. The half-dead tailor was dragged out of the lists and hanged. Some accounts have Pluvier finishing him on the sand first, dashing his head down before the body went to the gallows, and the versions differ on that detail, on whether the man on the rope was dying or dead. Either way, the town got its spectacle complete. Verdict, confession, and execution inside the hour, with the bell going the whole time. The audience did not walk away entertained. Descouchy, writing his chronicle afterward, called the thing abominable to record, and said many of those present found it contrary to the faith itself, a strong sentence from a man whose day job was writing down the 15th century. Olivier de la Marche, decades later, still remembered it as too base a matter for the court of Burgundy to have watched. Philip seems to have agreed. The Duke left Valenciennes reportedly disgusted, moved soon after to strip the town of the dueling privilege that had forced him to sit through it, and the following year staged a splendid chivalric tournament, as though the nobility needed to rinse its mouth out with the pretty version of violence. None of that helped Mahiot Coquel, whose last hour was spent blind and broken under a stranger's knees, listing his military service to a duke who never moved, in front of a crowd who came for exactly what they got. Commoners fought like that in the marketplace. The nobility had their own appetite for formalized slaughter, and a century before Valenciennes, they staged its most celebrated banquet. In 1351, during the wars over Brittany, the captains of two garrisons, one French at Josselin, one Anglo-Breton at Ploermel, agreed to settle their accumulated grievances with an arranged combat of picked men, 30 against 30, in an open field between the towns, on foot, with swords, spears, axes, and daggers, no quarter required. Half judicial challenge, half tournament, entirely lethal. The 60 men hacked at each other through a whole morning until both sides were too exhausted to stand, and during the agreed pause they drank wine among their own dead, dressed wounds and went back in. The French captain, Beaumanoir, bleeding badly, called out for a drink, and one of his own knights answered him with a line France repeated for 300 years. Drink your blood, Beaumanoir, and your thirst will pass. The fight resumed and turned when a French squire mounted a horse. In a fight, everyone had agreed to hold on foot and rode down the English line from behind, trampling their formation open, and the French finished it. 9 of the Anglo-Breton side were corpses on the grass, including their captain. Every survivor was captured, and the French had buried 6 of their own by nightfall. Every man who lived carried scars from it for life, and Froissart says that decades later, survivors were honored at royal tables above all other guests, seated first, served first, their faces cross-hatched with the proof. Chivalry called it the noblest deed of arms of the age. Count the bodies, and it was 15 men dead in an afternoon over garrison quarrels and reputation, cheered from the sidelines by both towns. For the nobility and the courts, meanwhile, the armoured judicial version was approaching its final and most famous performance in Paris. And before Paris, there is a stop to make in England in 1380, at a fight where no single wound killed anybody, and a man died all the same. Sir John Annesley, an English knight, had accused a squire named Thomas Catrington of treason, specifically of selling out a fortress in Normandy to the French, a castle Annesley held a claim to through his wife. The case dragged for years before it came to battle before the boy King Richard II, and the crowd that turned out in London was said to rival a coronation. The 2 men fought on foot in full armour, spear, sword and dagger, and the fight became a demonstration of what armour actually costs the body wearing it. Plate and padding on a summer day cook a man. Every exchange spends him. Annesley and Catrington hammered at each other through the stages of the fight, closed, grappled, went down together, and by the later phases the squire, the bigger man, was moving like a drowning swimmer. Annesley got him to the ground. At one point the knight, half blinded inside his helmet, asked the officials to straighten him toward his opponent so he could continue. Catrington could no longer rise. He was carried out of the lists insensible, defeated by his own exhausted flesh as much as any blow, and he died the following day, raving, without ever recovering his senses. A judicial duel could kill you without cutting you. The heat and the armour were sometimes enough by themselves. French courtiers of the same generation like to tell an older story about their own lists, and whatever you make of it, it was told as sober history for centuries, painted on walls, carved over doorways. A gentleman of the royal household, Aubry de Montdidier, was murdered in a wood near Montargis, ambushed and buried where he fell, and the only witness was his greyhound. The dog stayed on the grave, starving, then came to Paris, and at court it did something no one could ignore. It flew at the throat of one particular knight, a man named Macaire, every single time it saw him. This one man, and no other. Suspicion has no better shape than that. The king, the story goes, ordered the matter put to the ordeal, man against dog in the lists, the knight armed with a club, the greyhound given an empty barrel to retreat into. In front of the court, the dog circled, dodged the club, and closed its jaws on Macaire's throat, and the knight, pinned and bleeding under an animal, confessed to the murder and was hanged for it. The tale as it stands sits closer to legend than to court record, and historians have never located the trial in any register. What the story preserves is the pure idea underneath every fight in this video, held so deeply that people found it natural, even with a dog as the champion. Guilt will out. Put the accusation in the lists, and God will give the innocent party teeth. 6 years after Ansley's fight, the idea got its greatest and most terrible test, and this one is documented from every side, from the court files down to a private notebook kept by one of the defense lawyers. The last judicial duel ever authorized by the Parlement of Paris was fought on the 29th of December, 1386, behind the priory of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, between Sir Jean de Carouge and the squire Jacques Legris, and at the center of it stood a woman named Marguerite, watching from a scaffold draped in black, whose life had been staked on the outcome without anyone asking her whether she cared to bet it. The two men had been friends. That detail belongs first. Carouges and Legris were both Norman gentry in the service of the same lord, Count Pierre of Alençon, and years earlier, their families were close enough that when Carouge's first son was born, Legris stood godfather at the font, holding the baby. Then life pulled them apart along the oldest seams there are, money and favor. Legris rose. He was a big, capable, educated man, charming where Carouges was not, and he became Count Pierre's confidant, showered with gifts, including a fine estate called Aunus-le-Faucon that Carouges considered, with some justice, to belong by rights to his own wife's family. Carouges meanwhile buried that first wife, and the boy Legris had held at the baptism died too, and the knight's fortunes curdled into lawsuits, several of them aimed at his old friend, all of them lost. He grew into a difficult, thin-skinned man, respected as a soldier and avoided as a neighbor. Around 1380 he remarried, to Marguerite de Thibauville, young, beautiful by every account, and carrying a burden of her own. Her father had twice betrayed the French crown, and the family name needed rebuilding as badly as Carouges' finances did. By all signs, the marriage was a genuinely close one. It would need to be. In January of 1386, Carouges travelled to Paris to collect money owed him for a military campaign. Marguerite stayed at a small chateau called Capomesnil with her mother-in-law, and on the 18th of the month, the mother-in-law went out for the day and took nearly the whole household with her, servants and all, leaving Marguerite effectively alone. That morning, a neighbor named Adam Louvel knocked. Louvel was a client of Jacques Legris, and by Marguerite's sworn account, he got the door open with small talk, then mentioned that Legris was near, and that Legris loved her and wished to speak with her. She testified that she rebuffed it, and that Legris then came in anyway, greeted her courteously, offered her money, and when she refused him, the courtesy ended. The two men seized her. She was dragged up the stairs to a bedchamber. She fought them, she testified. In detail, the court made her repeat aloud, screaming until Legris gagged her mouth with his own hood, and while Louvel helped hold her down, Legris raped her. When it was over, he stood, straightened his clothes, and told her that if she spoke a word of it, she would be dishonored and destroyed, and that if her husband heard of it, her husband might kill her. Then he tossed a purse of coins at her, and she testified that she threw it back at him, telling him she wanted none of his money, she wanted justice. The two men rode away. By the reconstruction of the timeline that the defense itself insisted on, the whole attack occupied less than an hour of one morning, and everything that follows grew out of it. Marguerite said nothing to anyone for days, alone in that house with her thoughts, until her husband came home. Then she told him everything. And here Jean de Carouge, a man nobody ever called gentle, did something that cuts against every assumption about his century. He believed her, immediately and completely, and he never once wavered from it through everything that came after, when wavering would have been the easy and even the profitable course. He convened her family and his, had her repeat the account before them, and asked their counsel. The obvious road, Count Pierre's court, was a dead end, and everyone at that table knew it. Legris was the Count's favourite, and indeed when the matter reached Pierre he ruled with open contempt, declaring the charge baseless, and suggesting Marguerite must have dreamed the entire thing. He ordered the matter closed. Carouges went over his head to Paris, to the king. Appealing to the crown meant invoking a procedure that had nearly gone extinct. French kings had spent more than a century strangling the judicial duel with restrictions. St. Louis had banned it from the royal courts outright back in 1258, replacing battle with the testimony of witnesses, to the fury of a nobility who considered fighting for one's rights the whole point of having rights, and the pressure never let up, so that in 1306 Philip the Fair partially caved and restored the duel, but only inside a cage of conditions. By the 1380s, the Parlement of Paris would permit one only for a capital crime, committed beyond doubt, with no possibility of proof by witnesses, where every ordinary avenue had failed. 4 locks on one door. A rape with no witness but the victim, denied by the accused, buried by the local court, checked every box. In July of 1386, Carouges formally appealed Legris before the Parlement, in the presence of the young King Charles VI, throwing down the gauge of battle, and Legris picked it up, denying everything on his soul and offering his own body in proof. The court then did what courts do. It took testimony for months. Marguerite, by now visibly pregnant, had to stand before panels of lawyers and repeat the assault again, aloud, in procedural detail, while Legris's advocates worked to establish that she was either lying or deluded. The defense mounted an alibi, witnesses placing Legris elsewhere across the crucial days, and countered the timeline by arguing no man could have covered the distances involved in one morning. Somewhere in the files sat the other explanation the defense floated, that Marguerite, honest but mistaken, had been attacked by some other man and talked herself into seeing Legris's face on him. Her answer to that never changed. She knew him. He was not a stranger in the dark. He was her husband's old friend, standing in daylight in her own hall, speaking to her by name. One member of Legris's own legal team, a lawyer named Jean Lecoq, kept a private notebook on the case, and it survives, and it is quietly devastating. In its pages, the man defending Jacques Legris confides that he could not tell whether his client was innocent. No one knew the truth, he wrote, only God. The Parlement evidently agreed. On the 15th of September, it announced it could not resolve the matter on the evidence and ordered the wager of battle, a duel to the death, the first ordered by the Parlement in a generation, and though nobody in the room could know it, the last it would ever order for such a cause. And bound into the order, by the automatic operation of the law we have been tracing this whole video, was the clause that gives this story its horror. If Carriages lost, the verdict of God would stand that the accusation was false, and the author of the false accusation was Marguerite. She would be burned alive. The lawyers on both sides understood the clause, the judges understood it, and so did she. Her husband's performance in a fenced yard, his footing on winter sand, the angle of another man's sword on one particular afternoon, all of it now stood between her and the fire, while she carried a child through the final months of the wait and delivered a son before the year turned. The fight was set for late November, then postponed so the king, who had been away preparing an invasion of England, could attend. So like the men of Valenciennes, the parties waited on a prince's calendar. On the 29th of December, 1386, the field behind Saint-Martin-des-Champs was ready, a walled monastery ground on the northern edge of Paris fitted out with lists and galleries, and the city emptied itself into it, thousands upon thousands of spectators, with the young king and his uncles and the whole glittering apparatus of the French court in the stands. Froissart says people had climbed onto walls and rooftops. Marguerite was brought to the field in a black draped carriage, and placed on a scaffold where she could watch, and where, if it went wrong, she could be taken directly to her own execution. Accounts of the day note that Carriages, before mounting, rode to her and spoke with her, and one version preserves his words, that on her account he was about to hazard his life, and that she alone knew whether their cause was just. She answered that it was, and that he should fight in confidence. Body and soul both, notice, were staked on her word. Dying in a false cause meant damnation on top of death. And Carriages was about to fight on nothing but his wife's testimony against every power arrayed on the other side. Then the oaths sworn kneeling before the marshal, on the crucifix, on the relics, each man swearing his cause true and his body free of charms, with the standard proviso hanging over the loser. Whoever fell would go to the gibbet at Montfaucon, dead or alive. And before the marshal cast the two men loose, heralds proclaimed the discipline of the field to the thousands packed around it. No spectator was to speak, cry out, cough loudly, or make any sign to either combatant while the fight ran, on pain of losing a hand, and anyone entering the lists would answer for it with his life. Thousands of Parisians on a freezing December afternoon ordered into silence under threat of the knife, so that for the length of the fight the great crowd stood mute, and the fight itself supplied the only noise in that corner of Paris. On the fight itself the sources pull in two directions, and I will give you both. Froissart, our most famous teller, has the classic version, a thundering joust, lances splintering, then swords on foot, a long heroic engagement. The men closer to the record, the royal chronicler at Saint-Denis, who seems to have been present, and the lawyer Lecoq, with his notebook, describes something shorter and uglier, fought mostly on foot, and modern historians tend to trust them. In their telling, the two armored men came together and fought at close quarters, and Legris, the bigger and stronger man, struck the first telling blow, driving his blade through Carouges's thigh. Blood came out over the armor, bright on a freezing day, and the crowd saw it, and by custom the sight of first blood meant the fight could no longer be honorably stopped. Froissart says Marguerite, watching her husband stabbed, sank into prayer. She was watching her own execution open its door. And then Legris made his mistake. If a man in a fight to the death can be said to have leisure for mistakes. Having wounded Carouges, he pulled the blade free and stepped back rather than driving in to finish it, perhaps expecting the leg to fold. Perhaps playing safe. The leg did not fold. Carouges came forward off the wound, closed the distance, and got his hands on him, and the fight collapsed into exactly what we saw in Flanders 2.5 centuries before. Armored wrestling, where skill at grips and raw desperation count for more than reach and youth. Carouges was the veteran of a dozen campaigns and a lifetime of grievance. He threw Jacques Legris onto his back on the sand, and once Legris was down, his own armor betrayed him. 60 pounds of steel that had shed every sword stroke now lay on his chest like a coffin lid, and struggle as he did, he could not rise before Carouges was on top of him, kneeling on him, bleeding on him. The next minute unfolded slowly, in front of everyone, with dialogue. Carouges broke open the faceplate of Legris' helmet, tearing the visor away, and with his dagger in hand he demanded, again and again, over the man's exposed face, that Legris confess. The crowd could see it, the pinned man and the knife, the pause. And Jacques Legris, with the point at his face and his death seconds away, with nothing left to gain by lying, and, if he was guilty, his soul to lose by it, answered in words several chronicles preserve. In the name of God, and on the peril and damnation of my soul, I am innocent of the crime. Carouges drove the dagger through his throat. The squire's body jerked under him and finished, and the fight and the trial were over. God had rendered verdict, and the verdict was that the man who had just denied the crime with his last breath had committed it. Everything after followed the machinery. Carouges, bleeding from the thigh, was helped up, and he turned first to the stands and to the king, who called him over, praised him, and ordered a gift of 1,000 francs on the spot, with a royal pension of 200 francs a year to follow. And within weeks, the courts added 6,000 gold livres out of Legris' forfeited estate, and a position in the royal household. Then the knight crossed the field to the black scaffold and to Marguerite, and husband and wife embraced in front of the crowd, and she came down from the platform that had stood ready to feed her to the fire. They rode together through the streets to Notre Dame to give thanks, the crowds cheering them the whole way. And behind them, on the field, the other procession was forming. The body of Jacques Legris, godfather to a dead child, favourite of a count, was stripped of its armour and given to the executioner of Paris, who dragged it through the streets to Montfaucon. A word on Montfaucon. It was the great gibbet of Paris. a stone platform out past the northern walls, crowned with 16 stone pillars joined by wooden beams, from which the hanged were left dangling in rows, months of them at a time, weathering in the wind for the whole city to see and smell. Legree's corpse was hanged there among the thieves, and it stayed there, rotting through the winter, the flesh going off the bones in public installments, and every person entering Paris from the north passed beneath him, and knew exactly who he was, and what a court of last resort had decided he had done. Carriages got a decade of the good life he had always felt cheated of, honours, money, a place among the king's own guards, more children with Marguerite. In 1396, he marched on crusade against the Ottoman Turks and died at the catastrophe of Nicopolis, in a battle followed by the mass beheading of thousands of French prisoners, an ending so drenched in blood that his own death barely registers in the accounts. Marguerite lived on, raising their son, holding the estates, and the case refused to close. Within a generation the rumour started, repeated by the chronicler Juvenal des Ursins, and then by nearly everyone for 400 years, that another man, a condemned criminal, had later confessed to the crime at Capomesnil, and that Marguerite, learning she had sent the wrong man to Montfaucon on her sworn word, retired from the world into a convent out of grief. Enlightenment writers loved that version, because it made the whole affair a parable about the idiocy of trial by combat, an innocent man tortured to death by God's silence. Modern historians who have gone back into the actual records find the confession story appearing late and garbled, unsupported by anything in the files, while the files themselves, the testimony, the timeline, the notebook of Legree's own doubting lawyer, are all still there to be weighed. Eric Jaeger, who spent years inside those documents for his book on the case, came out believing Marguerite. Others still feel the pull of Legree's last words, spoken at knife point with damnation on the table. 6 centuries on, the honest position is the one Jean Lecoq wrote in his notebook while the trial was still running. No one really knew, except God, and God's only comment was delivered through a dagger. 12 years after Carouges wiped his dagger, England prepared a duel even grander, and the strangest thing about it is that the most consequential judicial combat in English history contains no combat at all. Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, cousin to King Richard II, accused Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, of speaking treason against the king in a private conversation the two of them had shared on the road, one duke's word against another's, no witnesses, the textbook deadlock. Richard ordered trial by battle at Coventry in September 1398, and the realm treated it as the event of the decade. Bolingbroke sent to Milan for armour from the finest armourers alive. Mowbray brought his from Germany. Stands went up on the green, and on the day the two dukes rode into the lists before an enormous crowd, took their oaths, closed their visors, and set their lances. And at the moment of the charge, Richard stood and threw down his baton. The marshals stopped everything. The king sat his court for 2 hours while the armoured dukes waited, and then announced that neither man would fight, and both would be banished. Bolingbroke for 10 years, Mowbray for life. God would not be consulted. The king had decided for him, and the decision destroyed everyone it touched, the king included. Mowbray wandered to Venice and was dead of plague within the year, still exiled, never cleared, never condemned. Bolingbroke's exile turned to disinheritance when his father died and Richard seized the estates, and the wronged duke came home with an army, took the crown for himself as Henry IV, and locked Richard in a castle where the deposed king died within months, by the most persistent account starved, either by his keepers or by his own refusal of food. A slower death than any sword in the lists would have given him. Contemporaries chewed on that for years. Had Richard let two men fight for 10 minutes at Coventry, one duke dies with honour and the crisis dies with him. He stopped the duel, and it cost him the crown and his life, and put a usurper's dynasty on the throne whose legitimacy England would eventually bleed over for a generation. The Church, for its part, had been growing queasy about that style of divine communication for a long time. Voices inside it had objected for centuries. A 9th-century Archbishop of Lyon wrote a whole treatise attacking ordeals as presumption, demanding to know where in Scripture God had promised to referee, and even an early Lombard king who kept the duel in his law code added, in writing, that he had no confidence in it, having seen men lose their causes unjustly, an astonishing thing for a lawgiver to admit in the law itself. The institutional break came at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, when the Pope forbade priests from blessing or participating in ordeals of fire and water. Without a priest to consecrate the iron, an ordeal was just a burn, and across Europe the hot iron and the cold water pit collapsed within a generation, with England, conveniently already equipped with juries, dropping ordeals almost overnight, the court records there showing none after 1219. But the duel slipped through the net. The council's decree closed with a clause reaffirming the existing prohibitions on single combat, and the distinction stuck. A duel needed no priest at its centre, just two bodies and a judge. And so while the other ordeals died in the 1200s, trial by battle marched on for 3 more centuries, fully armed. A German legal text from around 1300 banned it in blunt terms that stick in the mind, the emperor forbidding the practice. The text explains precisely on account of the many innocent men convicted by it, for no better reason than a weak body. Somebody at the heart of the system said the quiet part in an official document. The strong were beating the truthful, and had been all along. Germans kept dueling anyway for another 200 years, until the Emperor Maximilian finally abolished the judicial form around the turn of the 1500s. France's coda came in 1547, past the medieval line but too instructive to skip, when King Henry II personally authorized one last combat of honor between two courtiers, Jarnac and La Chataigneraie, over an insult involving Jarnac's stepmother. La Chataigneraie was the finest fighting man at court, and the outcome was considered so certain that his people prepared a victory banquet beside the lists, tables, plate, food for 150 guests. Jarnac, the underdog, had quietly taken lessons from an Italian master, and in the fight he stepped in and cut his opponent twice behind the knee, severing everything, dropping the great champion into the dirt crippled in front of the king. Jarnac spared him, repeatedly asked the king to take back the beaten man's life as a gift. and La Chataigneraie, lying there ruined, publicly shamed, his banquet waiting, answered by refusing all treatment. He tore the bandages off his own legs and bled himself to death over the following days rather than live under the mercy, while, the story goes, his servants let the mob eat the victory feast. Henry II took the death badly, having authorized the fight, and then watched his favorite bleed out of it by choice, and he reportedly swore that he would never grant another. The French crown never sanctioned another one at any rate. The phrase coup de Jarnac survives in the language to this day, and depending on the century you ask, it has meant either a stroke of genius or a stab in the dark. France arguing with itself forever about whether the clever man cheated. England, typically, never got around to abolishing anything. The judicial duel there simply fell asleep. Juries took the work, the appeals of felony rusted, and the last certain battles were fought in the 1400s, though the forms stayed on the books, and every so often the sleeping law twitched. Under Elizabeth I in 1571, a property case actually got as far as a fully staged trial by battle, lists built in a London square, thousands of spectators, champions hired and sworn, before the parties settled at the last moment and the crowd went home disappointed. Lawyers noted with professional unease that nothing had actually been repealed. And across the Irish Sea, a dozen years after that London anticlimax, the Crown's own officials in Dublin proved the machinery still ran when someone chose to crank it. Two Irish gentlemen of the O'Connor family, Tague and Connor, kinsmen locked in a feud, accused each other of treason, and rather than untangle it, the Queen's Council in Ireland granted them trial by combat and staged it in the courtyard of Dublin Castle in 1583, with the justices watching from a platform. The two cousins were searched for hidden weapons, stripped to their shirts, and set on each other with sword and shield. Connor went down wounded, and Tague got on top of him, and there, under the eyes of the assembled government of English Ireland, he finished his cousin on the cobbles, then cut off his head, stood, and presented it to the justices on the point of his sword. The Lords accepted the head. The record of the proceeding survives in the state papers, filed among the ordinary correspondence of colonial administration, one official noting the event with satisfaction. A feud had disposed of itself at no cost to the Crown, two troublesome gentlemen reduced to one, and that one now on notice. So much for the theory that the 16th century was above this. The right was all still there, dormant, like a loaded gun hanging on the wall of a house where everyone had stopped seeing it. It hung there for 2.5 centuries. Then, in 1817, in the industrial Midlands, a young woman was found dead in a pit of water, and the gun came off the wall. Her name was Mary Ashford. She was 20 years old, a gardener's daughter working as a housekeeper for her uncle near the village of Erdington, outside Birmingham, and on Whit Monday, the 26th of May, 1817, she went to a dance at an inn called Tyburn House. Friends remembered her excited about it for days beforehand. She had walked into town that morning, changed into her dancing clothes at a friend's house, and at the inn she spent much of the evening dancing with a young man named Abraham Thornton, a bricklayer's son from a nearby parish, heavy-set, self-assured, with money in his pocket and a local reputation with women that would be repeated at length in the papers soon enough. Witnesses later testified to a remark Thornton made that night when someone told him who Mary was, a remark about her and about what he intended, crude enough that the newspapers printed it in dashes. Around midnight, Mary left the dance with her friend Hannah Cox, and Thornton walked with them, and at a fork in the road, Hannah went one way home and Mary went the other, with Thornton beside her, into the dark of the lanes. A labourer saw the two of them standing together by a stile at about 3 in the morning. Around 4, other early risers saw Mary alone, hurrying back to her friend's house in the grey light, where she changed out of her dancing dress, collected her things, and set off for her uncle's, apparently composed, along a path that crossed the fields. She was seen on that path a little after 4. 2 hours later, a passing workman noticed a bundle, her shoes and bonnet, set neatly at the edge of a flooded marl pit beside the path, with a track of footsteps going down to the water. They dragged the pit and brought Mary Ashford up drowned. The examination of her body and of the ground told a brutal story in fragments. Her arms carried bruises shaped like a tight grip. Blood marked her clothing and the grass in a harrowed field near the path, where the dew and the soft soil had also recorded a running trail, a man's footprints and a woman's, the strides lengthening, the woman's track ahead of the man's, and then a trampled patch where the running stopped. The medical men concluded she had been raped, and the marks in the field suggested a chase before it. How she then came to be in the water, whether she was thrown in or held under, or went in herself past despair, the pit kept to itself. Thornton was arrested the same day, and he did not run from the core of it. He admitted he had been with her that night, admitted intimacy, insisted it had been consensual, and insisted he had left her alive and well and gone home. At the August Assizes in Warwick, the crowd was so thick people fainted in the courtroom, and the trial turned entirely on clocks. A string of witnesses had seen Thornton on his homeward road, miles from the pit, at times that made the murder nearly impossible if their clocks were right, and in 1817 no 2 village clocks agreed with each other, so the whole case dissolved into a fog of estimated minutes. The judge summed up in Thornton's favour. The jury needed only a few minutes to acquit him. Half the country refused to accept it. The case became a national obsession on a scale usually reserved for wars. Rival pamphlets came off the presses for months, some laying out the case for Thornton's guilt field by field and footprint by footprint, others defending the verdict, and the authors went after each other in print like duelists themselves. Ballad sellers hawked verses about the murdered maid of Erdington. A melodrama built on the case went on stage within the year, with the names barely disguised, and magistrates in some towns banned performances for inflaming the public. Sightseers walked the path Mary walked, stood at the edge of the pit she was pulled from, and carried away handfuls of the ground as keepsakes. A dead housekeeper of 20 had become, without anyone deciding it, the most famous woman in England, and the man acquitted of killing her could not cross a street without being pointed at. What happened next is the reason the case belongs at the end of this video. English law still contained the appeal of murder. the ancient private prosecution that let a victim's nearest male heir haul an acquitted man back before a court, a survivor from the same medieval world as everything else we have covered, and public subscriptions raised the money to use it. Mary's brother William, a slight, quiet young man in his early 20s, sued out the appeal, and in November 1817, Abraham Thornton was arrested again and brought to Westminster Hall before the Court of King's Bench to answer for the murder a second time. The clerk asked whether he was guilty or not guilty. Thornton had been coached by his lawyers, who had done their homework in books nobody had opened in earnest for generations, and he answered with a formula out of the 13th century. "Not guilty," he said, "and I am ready to defend the same with my body." Then he pulled on a large gauntlet of white tanned leather, made for the occasion after the medieval pattern, fingerless, laced up with thongs, and by the descriptions ornamented with stitched tracery like something out of an armory inventory. He took its twin in his hand and threw it down on the floor of the court, the ancient gesture performed under gaslight in front of barristers in horsehair wigs, one of whom had to explain to the stunned gallery what they had just watched. Abraham Thornton had demanded trial by battle. If William Ashford picked up the glove, the two of them would meet in lists 60 feet square, in leather, bareheaded, with wooden staves, and fight from sunrise. And if Thornton could kill his accuser or hold out until the stars appeared, he walked free of the murder forever. If he gave up or was beaten, he would be hanged before the sun finished setting. The courtroom, by the accounts, sat in silence for a long moment while that sank in, and then the arguments began, and they ran for 5 months. William Ashford's counsel tried everything to knock the gauntlet off the table. Battle was barbarous, they argued, absurd in a modern nation of steam engines and newspapers. And anyway, the evidence of Thornton's guilt was so strong that he should be denied the privilege, because the old books themselves refused battle to a man taken red-handed. Thornton's counsel answered with the one argument that could not lose: show us the repeal. Parliament had never touched the statute, no court had ever abolished it, and English judges do not get to delete laws they find embarrassing. The judges, 4 of them, took the point with visible discomfort, and in April of 1818 gave judgment. The Lord Chief Justice, Lord Ellenborough, put it in a sentence that has been quoted in law schools ever since: the general right of appeal was met by the general right of battle, and, in his words, it is the law of England. The court might wish the law otherwise, he said, but wishing was not their office. Trial by battle was, at that hour, on that day, in the reign of George III, still a living mode of trial in England, and Abraham Thornton was legally entitled to settle a murder charge with a wooden stave in a sandpit. That left the choice with William Ashford, and the choice was no choice. Contemporaries describe him in the courtroom, small beside the man he was pursuing, and everyone, including his own lawyers, understood what the lists would mean. Thornton was a big, powerful bricklayer in his prime. William was neither big nor powerful, and the fight the law offered him carried the old terms in both directions. An appellant who cried craven or lost the battle faced imprisonment and infamy, having in law proven himself a false accuser, the same logic that once stacked wood for Marguerite de Carouge. He declined the combat. With battle refused, the appeal collapsed. Thornton pleaded that he had been ready to defend himself with his body and no one had taken it up. And on the 20th of April, 1818, the court discharged him. He walked out of Westminster Hall, a free man twice over, acquitted once by a jury, and once by a glove nobody dared pick up. Free and unlivable. Crowds gathered wherever he was recognized, and he was recognized everywhere. His face had been in print shops for a year. He decided on America, and even the ocean nearly refused him. He booked passage under a false name, and when the passengers of the ship discovered who was traveling with them, they rose up and forced him ashore rather than share a deck with him. He finally got out of Liverpool at the end of September 1818 on a ship called the Shamrock, and in New York he sank into the anonymity he wanted, working as a bricklayer, by later report marrying, raising children, prospering modestly. One 19th century account has him dying around 1860 in Baltimore, a settled tradesman of about 70, though nobody has ever produced a record to stand behind the claim, and it may be no more than the ending people felt the story needed. Whether he killed Mary Ashford went with him, wherever he went. He is the only person who ever knew. Parliament moved with rare speed to make sure no one could ever throw the glove again. In 1819, on a bill brought by the Attorney General, who told the Commons it was high time such proceedings stopped disgracing the courts, the appeal of murder and the wager of battle were abolished together, root and branch, and the drafters went through the statute book with a torch while they were at it, sweeping out the private appeals for treason and felony and the right of battle in the old land actions, every last medieval door closed and bricked over in a single act. A single Birmingham murder case had done what the Church, the Enlightenment, and 600 years of legal grumbling never quite managed, and the judicial duel, born in the oath troubles of Burgundian kings 13 centuries earlier, died in a regency statute prompted by a bricklayer's gauntlet. Mary was buried in the churchyard at Sutton Coldfield, and the public subscription that had funded her brother's doomed appeal also paid for her gravestone, and the stone is its own small verdict on the age. The inscription cut into it offers her death as a warning to young women against, in its words, the danger of straying from the paths of virtue, the wording aimed after everything at her. She had gone to a dance. The man she danced with outlived her by decades on another continent, under the protection, at the very last, of the oldest and strangest right in English law, and the last gauntlet ever thrown in an English courtroom was carried out of Westminster Hall by his attorney as a souvenir. Somewhere out there, supposedly, that glove still exists in a collection, and I think about that object a lot. If you stuck with me through all 13 centuries of this, thank you, genuinely. These long ones are a labor of love, and the comments make them worth it. So tell me which of these fights is going to live in your head. Everything that keeps this channel alive is down in the description and the pinned comment, the Patreon and the YouTube memberships, and to everyone already supporting, you are the reason this exists. Sleep well if you can. See you in the next one.